So welcome guys, thanks for coming along today or tonight to my presentation, How to Start a Podcast. Presentation is called How to Build a Podcast over 20,000 downloads per month. My name is Lawrence Neal and I've got a podcast called Corporate Warrior, which is all about high intensity strength training in terms of like helping people that are passionate about high intensity training, but also people that are interested in high intensity training business too. So that's what my podcast is all about. So who am I? As I said, my name's Lawrence. I've been living in Ireland for about 8 months. Before that, I'm from the UK and I lived in London and worked in B2B tech sales for around 8 years. Always kind of wanted to be an entrepreneur and have my own business, tried loads of things, tried blogs, affiliate websites, info product businesses, fill in the blank, and nothing really worked for me. I had quite a successful career in B2B sales, but I wasn't necessarily happy doing that. And all the while I was thinking about, what can I do? What sort of business can I start? And then I come across, during this time I was always really passionate about health and fitness, and always trying to learn how I can, be healthier and improve my diet, improve my exercise and stuff like that. And I came across this book, and hence the acronym BBS, which stands for Body by Science. And Body by Science is a book all about high intensity training. Completely changed the way I looked at exercise, blew my mind, and started me on a path where I started this business, this blog called Corporate Warrior, which is all about kind of trying to address the busy corporate professional who doesn't have time to get fit, because this workout program that I discovered was all about how you can get a very effective workout in a very time efficient manner. So me and my best friend at the time, Stuart Ralph, we decided to start a business together where we would sell info products that taught people how to do that. We started the business, we created a video sales letter, didn't really work out. He had a lot of things on the go. We decided to go our separate ways, and I kind of stopped doing that business because I wasn't very good at it. So instead I focused on just creating content, trying to create blog content and blog posts to help people. And then I can't even remember the moment I decided to do this, but I kind of was so curious after I read this book. I had so many questions, so many follow-up questions, that I wanted to reach out to the author. His name is Dr. Doug McGuff, which is a funny name, but this is actually going to go live on the internet, so that's probably not the best thing to say. But nonetheless, he's an incredible, brilliant man, and someone I've had on my podcast multiple times. And I was so blown away by the book that I wanted to talk to him and ask him a whole load of questions. So we did an interview. I didn't have a podcast, didn't have a show, nothing like that. It was just an interview that I was going to post on my website. I kind of knew what a podcast was back then, but this was like 3 or 4 years ago. So podcasts weren't really, a thing. They weren't really that popular back then. And Doug, even though he was quite a big name in this niche, this high intensity training niche, he's such a kind and gracious guy that he was quite happy to come on to what was, nothing. I had no audience at the time. And that's that kind of, I'm going to cover this a bit later about how to get guests, but you just have to ask. You have to ask and someone's going to say yes. You have to play the numbers a little bit, but we'll get into that a bit later. So I realised through this experience, through interviewing Doug, that I was so passionate about learning and just growing as a person and just trying to understand more about this thing that I've become passionate about. And then also teaching what I've learned to others. That's really, I think, what I'm quite good at, is learning things, implementing them and passing them on. I think that's, as cliche as it sounds, I feel like that's kind of one of the things I'm good at, and doing that through the written word and through podcasts is probably what I'm supposed to be doing. I feel like that's my strength. And I was in sales for almost around 8 years, so I developed a lot of skills in terms of selling and asking good questions and listening, which transfer really well into podcasting. So that was pretty critical for me. And then after a certain amount of time to the podcast, I turned it into a business. I started a few revenue streams, and an opportunity came up where my now partner, Aisling, she's from Kerry in Ireland, and she wanted to move back home for various reasons. And I saw it as an opportunity because London is quite an expensive place to live, and I'd saved enough money from some of the success I'd had in terms of sales commissions to give me a bit of a buffer so I could come to Ireland, focus on my business, do what I love, and focus on trying to drive more revenue through that business. And sort of 8 months later, because I moved here in moved to Galway June 2017. So now, as the time of this recording, it's February 2018. The business, the podcast now brings in enough revenue to support me, and it's continuing to grow, which is really, really fun and exciting. So now I'm a full-time podcaster and blogger, which is kind of strange and surreal to say. So that's the start of my journey, and some of you guys here will probably think it's quite weird to see me in a suit, but that's how I used to look every day. And thank God I don't do that anymore. So, okay, so obviously you're not here to learn all about that, but I think that was good to give you a bit of context as to my story, where I came from, why I'm here now. But obviously you're here to learn about like how to start and build a successful podcast. And there's a few things we need to address before we even go there. And I think the number one question that I think a lot of people don't talk about is, why podcasting? Podcasting is really hot right now. It's a trend. Everyone's jumping on it. That doesn't mean you should necessarily do it. And I suppose this is a bit of a controversial thing to say, since I'm trying to encourage people to do a podcast, but there's a lot of different mediums out there. There's obviously blogging, there's video, there's probably other things I can't think right now. Podcasting is just one medium. And I think if you're trying to jump on something that's a trend, but it's not in line with your strength, or you're not actually passionate about developing that medium, that's the wrong reason to do it. Because it's not going to be perennial, it's not going to be evergreen, and if it's a trend, it's not going to be this popular in a year or two. Something else might take center stage, like blogging, who knows, or some other medium, something to do with cryptocurrency or something like that. So I do think that you really need to think about, is this for you? Only do it if you're really interested in podcasting as a medium, not because you are just trying to jump on a trend. So you've had to think about that. You decided, okay, no, I think I can do the audio format. I think I can do a podcast. That's for me. Excellent. Next thing you need to think about is category. So it's very popular in business to talk about finding a niche, finding like a niche business, where you're not going to have as much competition. And the same is true for podcasting. So there's a popular book called The 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. Guys, by the way, just so you know, I will take this footage and upload some notes to the description in the YouTube video, but also on the Facebook group. So if you don't write everything down, I say, don't worry. So there's this popular book called The 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. And in that book, there's a chapter called The Law of Category. And in essence, the law of category just means if you try to compete in an existing category, you're going to be trying to compete with people that already have everyone's attention in that category. For example, my podcast used to be all about general productivity. The theme was optimizing health, business, and lifestyle. I'm interested in all those things, yes, but it's so broad that I was competing with people like Tim Ferriss, who's like massive and getting like 300 million downloads or something. And there's so many productivity podcasts out there. I was just getting lost in the noise. So I don't think that's a very, very clever strategy. Whereas now I've kind of niched down and focused on high intensity training because no one else is covering that subject in podcasting. And it's just, that's where all of my audience have grown. Like I've really dominated that niche. And now I'm really passionate about continuing to appeal to that niche, but also seeing how they convert the fringe fans. And some of you might be familiar with a concept called 1,000 True Fans, which is where you focus on a niche audience, people that are going to absolutely love your content because you're totally original and you appeal to their interest. But there are, if you look at it like concentric circles and you imagine your niche being the middle circle, you've got these other circles that overlap, who are like the fringe fans. And what you find is that these 1,000 true fans almost become like your word of mouth army and help you convert these other people. That's far cheaper and more effective way to build an audience versus trying to do something broad and trying to appeal to everyone. So, has anyone got any questions at this point? Because I'm quite happy to, if anyone's got any. No questions, cool, no problem. So that's the whole law of category. So again, just to reiterate, I niched down focusing on high intensity training and businesses in high intensity training because really no one was doing that. So I think that's really important. So how do you find a niche? So you need to figure out what are your interests. This is how I would figure out, what are your interests, and brainstorm that out on a piece of paper, and then what are you really good at? And then try and find where that intersects and then go for it. That's where you want to start building a niche podcast. I know of podcasts that are focused on looking after chameleons, and the podcast is just about that. And that how can you get any more niche than that? You probably can't. And that podcast is quite successful. So that gives you an idea of the type of niches that are available. And this is the thing, podcasting's still quite young, which makes it really exciting. You've got things like Alexa and Google Home and these devices that are making audio even more of a thing in our lives. And it was just this Christmas just gone. I was at my parents' house, and my dad's got this Alexa thing, and I said, Alexa, play the latest episode of Corporate Warrior, and he just started playing straight away. He was like, what? And I was quite blown away because I wasn't expecting it. But I think what we're seeing is that the cool thing about voice is it can be consumed as a passive second activity to whatever you're doing. So that's pretty cool, because it means you could be doing something like washing up or cycling or running or walking or whatever, or commuting, and you can still consume it. And I just think there's a lot of potential there for growth. So there's still a lot of niches that haven't been addressed yet. Format, I do long form. I always believe there's a market for long form content, so I kind of default to that. And also there's sometimes very kind of Joe Rogan-esque, like 1 to 2 hours in length, sometimes longer, and very minimal production on the main, because to be frank, I can't be bothered to edit the main that much, and it can be quite labour intensive and costly to edit the main. But you don't have to do that. If you want to do highly produced podcasts, you can. It's completely up to you. I know people that do 10-minute podcasts, 20-minute podcasts, 5-minute podcasts. Whatever the format that works for you is fine. You need to obviously test things for you. Find out what works for you, what do you enjoy, and what resonates with your listeners, and you will get plenty of feedback from listeners. Now, I recently did I do 8 episodes a month that are 1 to 2 hours in length, and recently I did like a 10-minute short in between, and I had a few people say, I love this format, please do more of them. So if I can be asked, I'll do more. We'll see. So format and frequency need to be looked at together, because if you say, okay, I'm going to do 1 podcast a week, then so if you do, for instance, if you decide to do long form, like 1 or 2 hour podcasts, and you say I'm going to do 3 a week, you might end up, in my opinion, overwhelming listeners and your audience, and that might actually cause some anxiety and cause for them to unsubscribe, which you probably don't want. So you might want to be careful, and obviously the workload required to put out that much content in that short time frame is quite heavy. So again, you need to weigh that up. I do think that in the beginning, even if you are passionate and you are very interested in starting a podcast, you want to set a low quota deliberately, because small wins have been shown to help you sustain something over a long period of time. If you go into this saying, I'm going to do like the best podcast ever, and it's going to be like, I'm going to do all this content, and it's going to be like a weekly and 3 hour long podcast, I just don't think the majority, like 99%, are going to be able to sustain that type of output. So you're better off going, right, I'm going to set myself a low quota, 1 every 2 weeks, and then seeing how it goes. And then commit to 6. So if you decide to do this, don't get overwhelmed by you see someone like, Tim Ferriss, who's got I think to this point he's got about 300-400 episodes. Some people have got, I think Joe Rogan's got over 1,000 episodes, and that can be quite daunting to see that and go, have I got to do that? No, you only need to do a few to see, firstly, how you feel about doing it. You'll learn a lot about doing it. You'll get better at communicating. You'll get better at listening. You'll get better at asking good questions. It's only going to benefit you. So just commit to 6. And again, this is me stealing advice from Tim Ferriss now, because I just really think this is critical. I think if you commit to 6 and then evaluate, do I want to continue doing this? And that's a great place to start. Okay, so equipment and software. I thought this was quite relevant. So this is a quote by Albert Einstein: everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. I think when you start off doing a podcast, keeping the format, the software set up, the equipment set up as simple as possible is so critical. This is my setup here. It's really basic. We've got, just so the viewers might not know this, but I'm in a conference where there's a in-person podcast set up around the corner. I don't even know how to use that. I've got a podcast with 20,000 listens a month, and I don't even know how to use like an in-person setup, because my setup is even simpler than that. I have a Audio-Technica ADR 2100 mic, which is a really affordable mic. I think it's around probably less than €100. So what's that, like $130 or something like that. It's a really good mic. It's reliable. It's good quality. And there's lots of options to choose from, but that's just the option I went with. And then I use Skype to record calls, because pretty much 90% of my podcasts are with guest interviews via Skype, so I just defaulted to Skype. And then I use somewhat software called Ecamm Call Recorder to actually record the video and the audio, although I only use the video for the conversation, so I can have the eye contact and the body language. I only publish the audio. So again, I kept it incredibly simple, and that's literally all I use to do it. Then you've got hosting and distribution. Obviously, you need a place where you can store your podcast on the internet for people to actually listen to. And ideally, you need somewhere that can produce what's called an RSS feed, which can then distribute your podcast to all the key properties on the internet. If you don't do that, you're not going to get any exposure. And you probably don't fancy manually sending your MP3 to people. So I use a platform called Libsyn, which stands for Liberated Syndication. So libsyn.com is a very affordable platform. I think the minimum package is like $5 a month, something like that. Or maybe it's a bit more than that, actually. But it's not very much. And it's really simple. You basically create an account on Libsyn. You create an account, your podcast name, your details, all that stuff. And then you just upload content, and then you select areas, the destinations where you want the podcast to be distributed to. So that could be, obvious ones are iTunes, things like SoundCloud, YouTube, and then even things like Tumblr, and then all the podcast aggregators. So there's lots of directories online that serve as like aggregators for podcasts. So you obviously want to be listed on as many of those as possible, and so that every time you upload new content, it just gets automatically distributed to all of these locations. But again, super simple. You don't have to use Libsyn. You could even use like a WordPress backend, which is a website software. It's open source, it's free, and you can literally host your podcast on that as well. Or there's Squarespace, which is again another website backend. There's a number of options, but I use Libsyn. It works well for me. And then obviously you need to edit the audio. I do very, very minimal editing. I literally like stitch an intro and an outro on. In fact, I outsource audio now because I hate it. I hate doing the editing bit. And thankfully I've got enough revenue coming in to justify that right now. But I do believe that starting out, it serves you well to actually get some practice using some of this audio editing software, because I think anything that you end up outsourcing in the future, you need to understand how labour intensive that is, how much that costs. I think just in terms of getting like a baseline competency before you outsource it. But I use GarageBand. Apparently it's not great from what most people tell me, because they use things like Audacity, and there's probably other options. The freelancer that I use, I don't know what he uses. Don't really care as long as the end result is good. But GarageBand's a good place to start. It's quite user friendly. It's quite simple. I think it's free. It comes with if you've got a Mac, it comes with the Mac. So it's kind of not free, but you know what I mean. That's what you can use to edit it. And then I've put a website at the bottom. I put it as optional because actually, as I was sort of explaining earlier, if you're just starting out and you're not sure whether a podcast is something you're going to do for the foreseeable, and you're just really trying to test out whether or not this is something that is going to work for you, then I don't even think you need a website. Like, don't just forget about it in the beginning. And then once you've got to that kind of 6th podcast episode, and you're like, you know what, this is something I want to continue doing. I really enjoy it. I'm really passionate. I'm getting a good response. Then it makes sense for you at that point to definitely start a website. And you can use the platforms I described earlier, so Squarespace, WordPress, fill in the blank. Website's pretty key because you can create additional value on the website for that particular episode on your podcast, so that you can send the user or the listener, so you can do a little call to action at the end of the episode. Check out the show notes on abc.com, whatever. and then it gives them a place to go where they can get additional value, and you can start building that as an asset. That becomes your like home base for everything you do, and you can start building an email list. So I have a website with plugins that have like opt-in forms, so people can put their email address in, and every time I upload a new episode I can notify them of that new episode. So that's very useful. Okay, so getting guests. Now if you want to, so not all podcasts are interviews, some are solo casts where people just talk. I do some of those myself and I quite enjoy the sound of my own voice, so I'm quite happy to do that. Sometimes people do podcasts where they're just two friends talking or whatever, and there's probably more varieties. But getting guests is having a podcast where you interview guests is kind of cool, because I don't think it's popular to say this, but pretty much all the guests I've had on my podcast have shared my episodes with their audience, and that's really helpful, especially if they're high profile, because every time they share your podcast you get exposed to thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not millions of people. For millions is probably a bit ambitious, who might be interested in your content and might end up listening to other work you've done, and then it helps grow your audience. So I do think it's a pretty effective way to grow a podcast by interviewing other people. So how do you get guests? So I've started off with, I've got a picture here. This is a picture from Glenn Ross, which is a popular film about real estate salespeople. It's very funny. There's an opening scene where Alec Baldwin walks in and he basically says, "You're all crap," and he just slates them. And one guy's making coffee at the back of the room and he says, "What are you doing?" And the guy's like, "What?" He's like, "Coffee's for closers, put it down and sit down," And it's very funny, it's very old school. It's very popular though, and that's where the saying "always be closing" comes from, which is a very popular sales saying. But it's kind of relevant to this, because at the end of the day we are selling, we are trying to get people to join us on our podcast, and there is a selling element to that. Why would they take their time out to do that? So I have kind of a format. I have an email which I use to do that, and I always start the email off with some kind of flattery, but it's not kind of artificial. It is authentic flattery. So I've actually been on their website, I read their books, I know X about them, and I'm starting my email off with, "Hi so and so, I really love this thing you did. I really love this part of your book." And I try and be specific, because I know as a person who gets a fair amount of emails about my show, that if someone is particular about something, that often is quite resonates with me, and I know that that's going to resonate with them. With them stands for "What's in it for me?" So this is my sales background coming out, and you need to think about them. What are their current projects? What are they working on? What are their objectives? Which you can get from their website. If you go on their website, you can kind of see, where their focus is right now. And then you can kind of play on that. You kind of say, "Look, come on my show so I can help you boost X or promote this." Obviously, you don't necessarily have to make your show all about that, but you can just give them the opportunity. And then leverage your assets. I'm quite fortunate. I'm at a place where I've done 123 episodes, so I've had high-profile people on the podcast. I get a lot of listens every month, so I can leverage those numbers and those previous guests to get new guests. But everyone starts with zero. Excuse me. So everyone starts with 0 readers, 0 listeners. So at the beginning, you just have to ask, and some people will say yes. But you get one, you leverage that. You get another, you build it up. And you play the numbers. People will say no. I still have people tell me no all the time. I do swing for the fences these days. I try and get some pretty big names on, but why not? Sometimes they say yes. It's quite cool, and it does get easier over time, as I've kind of explained. Growth. Okay, so you start a podcast and then you have an ambition to grow it and build your audience as fast as possible. How do you do that? To be honest, if you take nothing else away from this but just this one thing, and I was talking with one of the chaps here about this at the start, is the best work markets itself. Focus on honing your craft and being the best podcaster you can in your own style, and that's where all of your focus should be in the beginning, because it's like any great product. Great products and services do, to an extent, market themselves, and podcast is the same. So really, that is, you can almost forget, well, actually you probably need some consistency, but you can almost forget the rest of those points and just focus on that. So I can't understate how important that is. If you neglect your craft and trying to hone that and create great work, it doesn't matter how, you don't want to promote, like kill yourself trying to promote something that's crap, or that's not very good. And yeah, so that's that. However, assuming you've got that part right, consistency is pretty important, whether you do weekly or bi-weekly or monthly. There's a really popular podcast out there called Hardcore History. That's really, really cool. It's a very entertaining podcast about like history. He did like a 4-part series on him, Genghis Khan, and that was really cool. And it's very, very popular. It's probably the most popular history podcast there is. And I think, I don't follow Hardcore History that closely now, but I think he does one like every few months, and now you have to pay for it. But because they're so grand and they're these masterpieces in effect, it's totally reasonable that he would have such a big gap between podcasts. But in any case, you want to be consistent with some kind of frequency, because consistency over a long period of time, which is what is created to build any type of audience, is necessary. When you start, so when you launch, I didn't do this and I regret not doing this, you want to upload 2 or 3 podcasts all at the same time. And ideally you want one which is like a preview, which is going to like drive subscribers at the start. But you want to launch 2 or 3 because iTunes will pick that up as being new and noteworthy, and that will give you greater exposure at the start, which will get you better downloads, which will get you a better ranking, and that will kind of propagate. So that's really useful, and I know people that have done that and got benefits from doing that. Obviously I didn't do that and I didn't know to do it, so that's kind of why I'm saying that now. And then getting guests to share it is pretty important. So whenever I interview a guest, I have like this template email that I send to the guest to say, please can you share it? I'm not that forward with it. I'm like, look, if you'd like to share it, here are all the links. But what I try and do is I try and get them excited about sharing it. So I try and give them like the show notes links. So I show them like a blog post on my website that's really detailed and looks good and that they'll be proud of. And then I also put in there like the code for Libsyn, which is mentioned Libsyn earlier, which is the hosting platform. So I put code in there, which is the code for the player if they choose to embed the player on their website, which some people do, and obviously the logo is on the player as well, which is a nice touch. But what I also do is I learned this actually having been interviewed myself, having people create cool images with me got me excited about sharing it on my channels, because I felt like a celebrity. Like I felt like, oh look, someone's done like this cool picture of me and they put this effort into putting a nice headline on it. Like that kind of appeals to my ego. And I've used the same thing with my new guests. So I will create an image of their face with the headline of the podcast, and I use an app called Over to actually edit the image and the text, and then I put it in Instagram, put a nice filter on it, and it just creates quite a professional looking image in my opinion. So I leverage that, and quite often the guests will take that and put that on their Twitter and Instagram. And if they've got like 100,000 followers on Instagram and like 30,000 followers on Twitter, you can guarantee that's going to get a fair few downloads. Social media, now social media is interesting because most people get distracted by social media, in my opinion. I think there's so many platforms. I think a lot of people are encouraged to be on every platform, but they don't necessarily get the return on investment that they should. And I think you're much better off focusing on a few platforms. For me personally, I've noticed that 75% of my referral traffic to my website comes from Facebook. And so a lot of my audience, they are of an older demographics. I'm not sure. I think that may correlate with Facebook users. But I notice that a lot of my traffic comes from Facebook, so I do focus on that as a social media platform. I do focus on sharing my content in relevant groups on Facebook, where they're relevant to the niche of that particular episode. But I think you have to be careful, because I just think a lot of social media is poor ROI, and I think you have to be pragmatic about it and objective and do something on social media and actually look at the output, look at what that brings you, because you might find that your time might be better spent going back to that first point, creating better work, rather than getting so focused on social media. Social media is really important in terms of your listeners getting your content and sharing it amongst themselves, which is different to you actually promoting yourself. The other problem with it is, unless you pay for it, the reach is not that great. Facebook, let's say you've got 1,000 likes on your Facebook page. Let's say every time you put a post out, 10% see that. Facebook can change their algorithm overnight so that you get 2% visibility. So you don't have much control over it, which is a big concern of mine. Don't get me wrong, I think they're great platforms, but I just don't rely on them. I'm much more reliant on trying to diversify traffic, but also looking at things like Google, so website ranking, and my email list, which I'm going to come on to. Building an email list is really important, because every time you do a new episode, as I stated earlier, you will send that episode to your audience, to your email list, and you have complete control over email. Well, not complete control, but you have more control. Obviously emails can get lost in spam and stuff like that, but you have more control over email than you do over social media, in my opinion. Monetization, so making the monies. This isn't a popular opinion, because I don't know whether some people here might think, or watching this might think, I want to start a podcast, I want to start a business. Well, I think if you're doing it to start a business, try and make money, I think that's the wrong reason to do it. I think there's much quicker ways to making money. Lots of businesses out there have been founded without having an audience beforehand. If you create a great product and service, and you're very, very selective about who you target and who your market is, I think you're going to make money faster. If that's your goal, if your goal is to make an income and make money, you might be better off pursuing some type of product or service, like a physical product or an info product or something like that, or more traditional business model, and maybe following something like Tim Ferriss has a concept in the 4-Hour Workweek called a Muse, which is a cash flow business, and there's a guy called Noah Kagan who has a program called Monthly 1K, and these are excellent courses. There's a lot of crap out there, so I pinpoint those ones as good courses to help people build businesses.